All right, there's two interrelated questions that I think are interesting. And the first one is why do most universities actually not produce that much innovation per dollar that's actually being spent? And then the other one is why is it that university labs actually don't focus on a lot of real world innovation? This is like a common thing that I think a lot of people wonder, and it's often a lot of political desire to make universities more innovative, but they often don't understand innovation when you actually hear about this. So the key thing that people are thinking about in that particular circumstance, if they're thinking about performance, is they're thinking about this very strict definition of what success actually looks like, and that is producing products and services that are profitable in the market. Now, there's a couple of things that are flawed with this assessment, and I'm not saying like it's flawed in a bad way. It's just, it is what it is, and it's a question that's often asked. The first one is that we can understand what is going to be successful at the beginning, right? And we have this sort of very easy way of looking into the future, what it means to create something that's successful. And what we know um, is that is very, very difficult to capture, right? It's very, very difficult to do, to pick what is going to be successful from the get-go. And the reason why we know this is if you look at investors, or if you look at simple investors like venture capitalists, um, or yourself, in terms of picking stocks, most of the time are really, really bad, right? There's all sorts of studies. I don't know about all sorts, but there's enough studies and enough evidence at this moment that suggests that we're very bad at picking what things are going to be profitable in finance, right? Like I think the majority of the field of finance in particular, and there's lots of papers that are being published in that area, basically have that assumption that we're just really bad at predicting what the future actually is, and that assumption tends to hold up. We don't know, right? This is there's assumption that's or at least one of the assumptions related to it is called information efficiency, um, and we just can't really predict the future very, very well. We just don't have enough information at our fingertips. That's totally fine. um, the other thing, and so this the second question that you might be asking is, why is it that companies can do it so much better than 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 universities? And actually, I would argue that they can't. Right? I don't think that they actually can. And what you're actually picking up is a secondary market, what's called a secondary market, like another market, where typically what happens is that managers are in the business of selecting, and businesses are in the business of selecting projects that have already become successful, right? So they have already identified what is successful, either within the company in terms of organic growth. The reason why it's called organic growth is because it's already growing. Right? The companies that don't grow and they don't do well, they exit out of the market. Right? They exit meaning that they go bankrupt. You don't hear about them, and there's tons and tons of companies that actually do this. Right? Steady failure. That is a big chunk of the companies that just simply cease to exist, or even companies that exist for a long time, they may not grow in the way that you're thinking about. um, the other thing is that companies that do grow and they're doing really well is that they tend to go through acquisitions. So they look for companies that are doing really well and they buy them out. um, you know we know even the sort of acquisition market, mergers and acquisitions, is that they predominantly, so the evidence and I'm not sure if I fully buy it, but there's enough evidence now that suggests the mergers and acquisitions, even themselves, are done poorly. So the managers can't pick, even when they identify that there is successful businesses that exist. And they can't really pick them very well, and they may not be able to actually manage them very well. It doesn't fit. There's evidence at this moment that sort of suggests that. Um, so that's the thing. So that's the first thing, is that you know it's very difficult to identify success in sort of looking forward. And then what we often have and we forget to look at is that there's secondary markets where there's people that are actually in the business to acquire resources that are already successful, projects that are already successful. Now, the other thing that we forget about um, is we forget that there's different missions that universities actually pursue that are really costly. I know businesses have some of the similar missions, but something about like teaching, right? So encouraging other people to share ideas and to ensure um, not only just share ideas, but ideas that tend to be valid and repeatable are it is very, very costly. Like it tends to be a bulk of the job, right? Like if you want to just think about your own job and what you actually do, if you don't have to teach anybody, you can accomplish things very quick. You can get efficient very quick. But as soon as you have to teach others, whether you're a manager or whatnot, right? It becomes like, oh my gosh, we got all these meetings that we have to do. We have to document all this stuff so many people can understand about it. Well, this is the same thing that happens in universities, but to a larger degree and often less resources for the individuals that are actually doing this, right? Because they have these sort of complicated goals that they're pursuing. One of them being teaching. Another thing that we forget about is that universities often have a public mission, right? So they may choose, and there's a really, really great paper that looks at fertility clinics by Mihaela Stan and Freak Vermillion. She's at University College London. I think he's at London Business School. I'm not sure if he's there. I think they're in Britain, anyways. And they have this great paper showing, it's sort of puzzling about like why is it that there's these efficiency differences in I think it was like equivalent to private private practices versus public practices. Um, and it was simply because the sort of ones that are pursuing the public mission have to take on these very, very much more challenging problems, right? Challenging cases. The other thing too is not only about challenging cases, but those people select into those roles to pursue those more challenging cases. So what we know is once you adjust, and they did some, if I remember correctly, they did some wonderful adjustments to show like, hey, actually, if you adjust for this sort of difficulty, that that they're actually performing better. They actually do spectacularly better because they're always working on these more difficult things, but it's very difficult to sort of look at that. So the products that are going in, or the inputs that are going into both of these, they're different, right? And that is good. That means that there is a healthy market that's going on. People are selecting, right? So it's like you as a as a candidate, you're not going to just get a education from Microsoft. That doesn't make sense. I know a lot of people do that, but it's very targeted, right? But if you want a robust education, um, you would go to a university and you would learn, one would hope, more robust education. I think that that is generally the thing that we would expect. So there's these differences that you actually see behind it because of these different missions that are often pursued that are much more um, distinct between them, right? So in of itself, the innovation is not necessarily it's not necessarily that universities are less innovative. It's just that we don't have good information to sort of make these broad comparisons between the two. And so this falls back on, the second question is why is it that most university patents, for example, why do they not perform well? If you actually look at it statistically, almost all of them don't perform well. They don't make, so performing being, if it's a patent, uh, that they make money. They typically don't make money. They typically are a cost. There is a lot of reasons. It's a complicated problem. There's one of them. Again, these different missions play in a matter, but also the fact that sort of forward-looking, what is going to actually work, really, really matters. The other one to think about is that you may not want to treat this as as necessarily performance enhancing, but more of an option type perspective. And so, what is an option? That is the right, not the obligation, to pursue something in the future, right? So these are more on the lines of hold these things, you acquire these things for the potential for growth in the future when things become a little bit more certain and you know what those things, those particular paths are. Um, so there's lots of reasons but why this exists, and it's often very, very a lot more thoughtful than you would think, in terms of, it's not just a straight off answer that, universities, for example, or university labs are just not really that smart. It's probably actually the opposite, is because that they're playing different games and serving different purposes typically. And then on top of it, even though that we have these beautiful metrics that exist, they are horrible typically. Like, most people complain about what these metrics exist to match on and to capture some of these effects, because they're just not capturing what we really want to capture often, right? Like, metrics are just metrics. They, like numbers, are just numbers. They don't really mean that much until you start looking at, oh, this is a lot more complicated than we thought. Um, there's these all these other things that we're trying to capture and trying to do, and so the efficiency perspective, which is often underlying this logic of why aren't universities more profitable with their innovation, is often misaligned in terms of what is actually going on, because it's capturing a single metric, and that is making financial returns. Now, the problem with this logic, if you start thinking about it from an options perspective, you don't know, as an investor, as a university investor, let's say you're a president, or like you're a governor and you're running, you have control over a university. You don't know what asset under your possession is actually going to be the next big thing that will revolutionize and change everything altogether, right? That's the fundamental uncertainty. You just don't know. And so you want to put um, different feelers out there and trying to capture what that actually is, right? You want to have your hands in many different assets to capture that one thing that may take off at some point in the future, and it's very difficult to know what that actually is, right? It's very difficult to know if you were to look back Now it's easy. We can look at, like, some of these California schools, for example. We know, yeah, it was easy that this would happen. But back in the 1960s, Berkeley and, maybe Stanford was a little bit different still then. It was still probably a shining case, but Berkeley, it's just a bunch of hippies. Um, you know, I'm not trying to be like rude, but that's exactly what it was, right? Like that's where the heart of a lot of this sort of stuff was going on, and it's very difficult to realize, like, hey, wait a minute, this is, the whole Silicon Valley thing would emerge from that back at that moment, and so you have to take a step back and say, okay, knowing that we cannot predict the future, what do we do, right? So we make investments in things that potentially could pan out, but realizing that there's very little return. One of the key things that you also have to realize is that the investment is not in infrastructure that matters, right? The infrastructure kind of matters, like there's to some degree that matters, but what is more key is building that infrastructure so that you attract the right people that can kind of see and forecast the future a little bit better than average people. So that's ultimately what it is you're trying to identify those people that um, can sort of see things around the corner. We don't know why, right? There's not great. I don't know why some people can foresee more than others. Typically, we know sort of basic things: education, life experience, something called, intelligence or IQ. I don't know exactly what that is. I don't think we have a great sense of what that actually is. It's related to training, it's related to many different things, your family background, all those kind of things. But we want to track, nevertheless, complicated individual factors that we want to bring in and entice. And how do we do that? Well, it's not only infrastructure, but it's also investing a lot in making life really nice. Right? Like ultimately, life really nice to attract people to these situations so that they can go. And at some point, right, this is the thing that it's the great debate, right? Um, how do we know if it's working? You kind of don't until it does. This is the massive challenge that anybody that studies innovation, um, you know, would understand. Very few people sort of recognize it, like talk about it. But yeah, some of my research I think is sort of related in this area. But you don't know until you actually know, and it's because it's very tippy. There's lots and lots of noise associated with predicting the future in innovation, and you really just often don't know. And so the only thing you could do is get people that are bright, intelligent, to want to come to your location, and encourage all that kind of stuff. Create that crazy, weird environment, um, where people just want to show up and be part of this thing. I wish I can give better recommendations, but it's very typical that there is a lot of failure along the way, right? So that's what I study typically, is that there's a tremendous amount of failure, and that failure is healthy, but we have to frame it in such a way that it's healthy rather than focusing on only the success outcomes. And that's it. All right. Take care and have a wonderful day. Hopefully, this answered those two questions.